The desert heat rose from the tarmac in waves so thick you could see them shimmer, making even the shadows dance like mirages. Captain Nico Reynolds stood beneath the wing of Juliet 4, her C-130 Hercules, checking system panels with fingertips that knew every rivet by touch. The aircraft wasn't pretty. Its gray paint had been scratched to a dull matte finish by years of sand and salt, and the metal around the nose showed the wear of countless missions. But Nico knew what others didn't. This old bird had more flight. Hours in hostile territory than half the fighters on the field combined, her crew worked with the quiet efficiency that comes from trust. Drew Martinez, her young co-pilot, crouched by the landing gear, wiping dust from pressure gauges with the careful attention of someone who'd learned never to cut corners. At 26, he still carried nervousness like a second uniform, but his hands were steady and his loyalty absolute. Marcus Wells, their loadmaster, leaned against the cargo ramp with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent 20 years jumping out of planes before a back injury grounded him from airborne ops. Near the rear, Thomas Ezra monitored diagnostics without blinking. If something beeped wrong anywhere on this aircraft, he'd know it before the computer did. The far end of the airfield told a different story entirely. Fighter jets gleamed like showroom models under spotlights, each one polished to mirror perfection. Camera crews moved around them in choreographed loops, adjusting angles while pilots posed in crisp flight suits. A mobile broadcast tent had been erected near the runway, complete with a branded backdrop and a water station stocked with bottles bearing the base logo. At the center of this circus stood Major Valerie Knox, public affairs officer, her tablet clutched like a shield as she barked updates through the base-wide comm system. "Pilots to ops check-in, please. Support and logistics personnel remain. Beyond the media perimeter!" Her voice carried across the field with the practiced authority of someone who'd turned military operations into photo opportunities. Near the fuel trailer, a ground crew tech smirked and nodded toward Juliet 4. "Look at that museum piece," he said loud enough for his buddies to hear. "Guess they're letting the cargo haulers play dress-up today." Captain Derek Rawlings walked past them at that moment, his flight suit unzipped just enough to show off his squadron patch. 3 weeks of combat operations had given him the perfect tan to match his perfect posture, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of confidence that came from knowing people were always listening. He glanced toward the C-130 and smiled. "Still flying that old crate," he said to no one in particular. "Didn't know cargo pilots got seniority now." His squadron mates laughed on cue. Someone raised a phone and snapped a picture of Juliet 4 with Nico in the frame, then quickly pocketed it like they'd captured something amusing. Nico didn't react. She noted the hydraulic latch angle, made a small mark on her checklist, and kept working. Her crew said nothing. Drew adjusted a strap near the nose gear and avoided looking across the field. Ezra's focus never shifted from his readouts, and Wells muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "Smile for the camera, boss. They'll crop you out anyway." Nico allowed herself one slow breath. The concrete beneath her boots held the day's heat, but she didn't step away. Her checklist was almost complete, and that was all that mattered. She double-checked the wing light housing, then motioned for Ezra to test the signal lights. They blinked to life one after the other, perfectly synchronized, unlike the chaotic red and blue beacon pulses behind the fighter line. Inside the operations tent, Lieutenant Colonel Julian Harrow adjusted his headset and pointed toward a wall-mounted display showing the day's scheduled sorties. Rows of sleek aircraft IDs glowed across the grid in neat, organized lines. Juliet 4 wasn't listed. The space where her call sign should have been remained empty, marked only as "Support Pending." From across the tent's opening, Major Knox lifted her sunglasses and gestured toward the entry. "Let's keep media clear of non-primary assets," she announced. "If they want static shots, we'll do a walk-around later, once we have the real birds in the air." Julian didn't disagree. He tapped another icon on his screen and zoomed in on the first departure window of the day. Outside, Derek stepped into a pocket of shade cast by his F-16 and sipped from a labeled water bottle. When another pilot asked about the mission parameters, he pointed vaguely toward the far end of the field. "We're loaded with high visibility. Runs," he said. "Not sure what the crate haulers are doing. Probably waiting for shade." Someone nearby chuckled. That's the Ghost Squad for you. Always fueled, never flying. But Juliet 4 stayed quiet, and her crew kept working. Every bolt was in place, every system checked twice. The aircraft might not gleam like the fighters, but she was ready for whatever came next. And in a world where preparation mattered more than presentation, that made all the difference. As the sun climbed higher, Nico stepped back from the wing and rolled her shoulders. The clipboard slid into its pouch with practiced ease. She didn't call out orders or signal to anyone. Her crew knew the routine. She turned once toward the control tower, noted the shifting angle of light, then walked to where Wells sat on the edge of the ramp. "We flying today?" he asked with a half-smile. Nico glanced at the sky, then back at the field where fighter crews laughed and posed near their pristine aircraft. "Not yet," she said quietly. Wells didn't press. Behind them, Drew was still reviewing wind data, manually double-checking every calculation against local terrain readings. Ezra unplugged diagnostic cables and secured panels without making a sound. They worked in rhythms that didn't need confirmation. Their names might not be on the schedule board, but they were ready. And sometimes, Nico thought as she watched, the circus unfold across the tarmac. Being ready was enough. The morning briefing room buzzed with the controlled energy that always preceded a major operation. Pilots filled metal folding chairs arranged in precise rows, their flight suits crisp and name tags gleaming under fluorescent lights. At the front, a large projection screen displayed mission parameters in clean blue graphics, target zones, flight paths, and weather conditions all laid out with military precision. Nico entered quietly, carrying a folder containing her own mission brief. She'd spent 2 hours that morning studying terrain maps and weather patterns, preparing for the cargo run that would support the fighter operations. Her helicopter crews depended on the supplies she'd deliver to forward positions, and she took that responsibility seriously. She found an empty chair near the back next to a group of younger pilots who were quietly reviewing their notes. As she sat down, one of them glanced at her shoulder patches and nodded respectfully. "Morning, Captain," he said. "Heard you've been flying these routes longer than anyone." Before Nico could respond, Derek's voice cut across the room from 3 rows ahead. "Easy there, Rodriguez," he said with a grin. "Don't get too impressed by the bus drivers. Different skill set entirely." A few pilots chuckled. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable and turned back to his notes. Major Knox stepped to the front of the room, tablet in hand. "Gentlemen and lady," she added with a glance toward Nico, "today's operations will be under full media coverage. We have embedded journalists with combat camera teams, so presentation matters. Remember, you're representing not just this base, but American air power globally." She clicked through several slides showing camera positions and interview schedules. Primary combat aircraft will be featured prominently. Support operations will remain background unless specifically requested for B-roll footage. Nico shifted. In her seat, she'd flown combat support for 8 years, delivering everything from ammunition to medical supplies under hostile conditions. The idea that her work was somehow less worthy of documentation didn't sit well, but she kept her expression neutral. Lieutenant Colonel Harrow took the podium next. "Weather's looking good for the primary strikes," he announced, "but we're tracking a storm system moving in from the west. Could affect afternoon operations." He paused, scanning the room. "Cargo runs will proceed as scheduled unless conditions deteriorate significantly." Derek raised his hand. "Sir, what's our backup plan if the storm hits during the main event? We don't want to keep the cameras waiting while we figure out logistics." "Valid concern," Harrow replied, "but our cargo assets are experienced with adverse weather. They'll adapt as needed." Nico felt heat rise in her chest. She'd flown through conditions that would ground most fighter operations, using terrain masking and low-altitude techniques that required years to master. But the way they discussed her capabilities, like she was an afterthought, made her jaw tighten. After the briefing, pilots gathered in small groups, discussing tactics and comparing notes. Nico approached the main planning table where Derek stood with several other fighter pilots, studying the large-scale map. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I wanted to coordinate timing for the supply drop. My route intersects with your egress path here." She pointed to a location on the map. "If we offset by 15 minutes, it eliminates any potential conflicts. Derek barely glanced at her. Finger on the map. Actually, we're adjusting that route anyway. Too much visibility from the ridgeline. He moved several markers without consulting her notes. Your cargo run can work around whatever we decide. The thing is, Nico said, keeping her voice level, I've flown this terrain before. That ridgeline provides cover if you approach from the northeast, but it also creates wind shear that— Captain, Derek interrupted, his smile sharp. I appreciate the input, but tactical flight planning is a bit different from cargo hauling. We'll handle the complex stuff. The other pilots exchanged glances. One of them, Captain Blake Morrison, looked uncomfortable. Actually, Reynolds might have a point about the wind patterns, he said quietly. Local knowledge is valuable. Derek's expression hardened slightly. Blake, when you've got my flight hours in contested airspace, we'll discuss local knowledge. He turned back to Nico. Thanks for the offer, Captain, but we've got this covered. Nico felt the dismissal like a physical weight. Around the table, other pilots suddenly found their notes fascinating. The room's energy shifted, becoming charged with the kind of tension that follows a public slight. Of course, she said simply. Just trying to help ensure mission success. As she turned to leave, she heard Derek's voice behind her, pitched just loud enough to carry, Some people think flying straight lines makes them tactical experts. The comment drew a few uncomfortable chuckles, but Nico didn't turn around. She walked out of the briefing room with her shoulders straight and her expression calm, even as anger simmered beneath the surface. Outside, Drew was waiting by the coffee station. He'd obviously heard at least part of the exchange through the open door. Skip, he said quietly. That was nothing, Nico cut him off. We've got a job to do. But as they walked back toward Juliet 4, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The dismissal wasn't just professional, it was personal. And in an environment where respect could mean the difference between life and death, personal attacks had a way of becoming dangerous. Wells looked up from his equipment checklist as they approached the aircraft. How'd the briefing go? He asked. Nico paused at the base of the ramp. In the distance, she could see Derek's group still gathered around the planning table, their laughter carrying across the tarmac. About as expected, she said. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The next morning brought new restrictions that landed on Nico's desk like a cold slap. The memorandum was printed on official letterhead signed by Major Knox and countersigned by Lieutenant Colonel Harrow. The language was bureaucratic and precise, but the message was clear. Cargo operations would now require pre-approval for any deviation from filed flight plans, effective immediately. Due to increased media presence and the need to maintain airspace security, the memo read, all support aircraft must coordinate any route changes through operations at least 2 hours in advance. This includes altitude adjustments, timing modifications, and approach variations. Nico read it twice, her coffee growing cold in her hand. 2 hours' notice for route changes meant she couldn't adapt to real-time conditions, weather shifts, ground threats, or tactical requirements that demanded split-second decisions. It was like asking a surgeon to plan every incision before seeing the patient. Drew looked over her shoulder at the memo. This is about yesterday, isn't it? He said quietly. Before Nico could respond, Wells appeared at the aircraft's side door, his expression grim. You might want to hear this, he said, jerking his thumb toward the maintenance hangar. They followed him across the tarmac to where a group of mechanics were working on various aircraft. The conversation stopped when they approached, but Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, a veteran crew chief Nico had known for 3 years, caught her eye and nodded toward a quieter corner. Captain, he said in a low voice, thought you should know, there's been talk about Juliet 4's maintenance status. Nico frowned. What kind of talk? Torres glanced around, then leaned closer. Someone's been asking questions about your last inspection cycle. Specifically whether you're fully mission-ready or just pencil-whipped through the system. The words hit like ice water. In military aviation, questioning an aircraft's maintenance status was serious business. It could ground a crew indefinitely while investigations were conducted. Who's asking? Can't say for sure, Torres replied, but it's coming from the top. Major Knox was down here yesterday with some clipboard-carrying type asking about your flight hours, crew rest compliance, all kinds of stuff. Drew's face darkened. They're building a case, he said quietly. Or trying to, Wells added. Question is, what kind of case? Their answer came that afternoon. Nico was reviewing weather reports when Captain Morrison approached her table in the pilot's lounge. Blake had always been decent to her, not overly friendly, but professional and respectful. Today, however, he looked uncomfortable. Nico, he said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but there's a rumor going around that you've been cutting corners on safety protocols. Nico's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. Excuse me? Look, I don't believe it, Blake said quickly. But Derek's been telling people that cargo pilots don't have the same standards as combat crews. Says the pressure to make delivery schedules leads to compromises. The accusation was so absurd it took Nico a moment to respond. Her safety record was spotless. 8 years of flying without a single incident, crew injury, or mission failure. She'd never cut a corner that mattered, never pushed equipment beyond its limits, never compromised crew safety for any reason. That's completely false, she said, her voice carefully controlled. I know that, Blake replied, but perception matters around here, especially with the media attention. Derek's got the colonel's ear, and with all the cameras rolling, he shrugged helplessly. That evening, Nico found herself alone in Juliet 4's cargo bay, running her, hands along equipment tie-downs that had been secured and resecured a dozen times. The aircraft was quiet around her, filled with the familiar sense of hydraulic fluid, metal, and the desert air that seeped through every seal. Ezra appeared at the rear ramp carrying a small toolkit. Thought you might be here, he said simply. Just checking things over, Nico replied. Ezra nodded and began inspecting cargo anchor points that had already been inspected twice that day. They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes before he spoke again. Had an interesting conversation with one of the sensor techs today, he said without looking up. Seems there's been some discussion about whether cargo crews really understand advanced navigation systems. Nico's hands stilled on the tie-down she was adjusting. Go on. Funny thing is, this tech remembered a mission from last year. Storm knocked out GPS over half the region, and guess who brought a medical evac helicopter home using dead reckoning? And terrain features. She remembered that night, 6 hours of flying through weather that had grounded everything else, navigating by compass and landmark to guide a crew with a critically injured soldier back to base. No fanfare, no media coverage, just another day's work. The point is, Ezra continued, some people remember who actually gets the job done when things go sideways. The next morning brought another memo, this one requiring cargo operations, to file detailed mission reports within 4 hours of landing. Fighter operations had 24 hours for the same paperwork. The message was subtle but clear. Cargo crews were being held to different standards. Drew found Nico in the operations tent, staring at the latest requirement. This is harassment, he said bluntly. This is politics, she corrected. But as she looked around the tent, at the gleaming fighter squadron photos on the walls, the media schedule posted prominently on the main bulletin board, the coffee mugs branded with fighter, jet silhouettes, she realized something important. She wasn't just being marginalized. She was being systematically pushed aside to make room for a narrative that didn't include her. And in a military environment where visibility equaled validity, invisibility could be career suicide. But Nico had learned something in 8 years. Of flying missions nobody else wanted. Sometimes the most important work happened when nobody was watching. And sometimes, when everyone else was focused on the spotlight, the real professionals were preparing for the moment when the lights went out. That night, she sat in Juliet 4's cockpit and pulled out a folded piece of paper from behind the instrument panel. It was a hand-drawn approach chart, sketched in pencil on grid paper, with notes written in the margins in her mother's careful handwriting. Her mother had been a C-130 pilot, too, back when women in combat aviation were even rarer than they were now. The chart was from a night mission during a Pacific storm when her mother had brought home a crew flying on instruments alone, with no radar, no GPS, just skill and determination. At the bottom of the page in faded ink were the words, "Approach 07. Blackout. When they can't see you coming, that's when you matter most." Nico folded the chart carefully and slipped it back into its place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new restrictions, new attempts to diminish her role. But she had work to do, and people who depended on her to do it right. Let them have their cameras and their politics. When the time came, she'd be ready. The crisis came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Nico was in the ready room reviewing weather reports over her second cup of coffee when the emergency klaxon shattered the pre-dawn quiet. The sound cut through. The bass like a blade, 3 long blasts that sent every pilot scrambling for their gear. All aircraft, came the voice over the intercom, crackling with urgency. "We have a priority medical evacuation. 2 critically wounded personnel at Forward Operating Base Delta. Immediate extraction required." Nico was already moving, muscle memory taking over as she grabbed her flight bag and headed for the door. But Major Knox's voice stopped her cold. "Primary rescue assets only," Knox announced over the comm. "Repeat, priority aircraft respond immediately. Support assets remain on standby." Nico froze in the doorway. Forward Operating Base Delta was a remote outpost 40 miles into hostile territory, accessible only by helicopter or small aircraft. The base's natural landing zone was tight, surrounded by rocky terrain, and known for unpredictable wind patterns. She'd flown that route a dozen times, knew every ridge and valley between here and there, but she wasn't primary rescue. Through the ready room windows, she watched Derek and 3 other fighter pilots sprint toward their aircraft. The problem was obvious to anyone who understood the geography. F-16s couldn't land at FOB Delta. They could provide air cover, but they couldn't extract wounded personnel from a mountainous outpost with no runway. Drew appeared at her shoulder, breathing heavily from his run across the tarmac. "Skip, we should be launching," he said. "Juliet 4's the only bird on this base that can get in and out of Delta's LZ." "I know," Nico replied quietly, watching the fighters prepare for takeoff. Minutes ticked by. Radio chatter filled the airways as the fighter package coordinated with ground controllers, but no actual rescue operation was taking shape. The wounded soldiers were still waiting. Finally, Nico made her decision. She keyed her radio. "Tower, this is Juliet 4 requesting immediate clearance for medical evacuation to FOB Delta." The response came from Major Knox, not tower control. "Juliet 4 remain on standby. Primary assets are handling the situation." "Ma'am," Nico replied, keeping her voice level. "With respect, primary assets cannot perform ground evacuation from Delta's terrain. Request permission to launch medical extraction." A pause filled with static and tension. Then Knox's voice, sharper now. "Juliet 4, you are not authorized for this operation. Remain on standby pending further instructions." Nico looked at her. "Crew!" Drew's jaw was tight with frustration. Wells stood by the aircraft's ramp, medical litter already loaded and secured. Ezra monitored radio frequencies, tracking the growing confusion as ground controllers tried to coordinate an evacuation with aircraft that couldn't actually land. 23 minutes after the initial alert, Derek's voice crackled over the radio. "Control, be advised we have visual on FOB Delta, but unable to attempt ground evacuation. Recommend dispatch of rotary wing or fixed-wing assets capable of mountain landing operations." The admission hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone on the frequency knew what it meant. They'd sent the wrong aircraft for the job. Lieutenant Colonel Harrow's voice cut through the chatter. "All available evacuation assets, report status immediately." This was it. Nico keyed her radio again. "Tower, Juliet 4 is configured for immediate medical evacuation. Crew standing by. Familiar with Delta LZ approach procedures." The silence stretched so long she thought her transmission hadn't gone through. Then Knox's voice, ice-cold with authority. "Juliet 4, you are specifically ordered to remain on ground. Any unauthorized takeoff will result in immediate disciplinary action." The words hit like a physical blow. Around the radio, her crew went still. Drew's face flushed with anger. Wells shook his head in disbelief. On the frequency, she could hear ground controllers at FOB Delta growing more desperate. Any available aircraft, we have 2 critical casualties requiring immediate evacuation. Bleeding is severe. Time is critical. That's when Captain Morrison's voice joined the frequency. Control, this is Falcon 2. I'm qualified for short field operations, but I don't have medical facilities aboard. Recommend we coordinate with cargo assets for proper medical evacuation capability. Blake was trying to help, but his effort only highlighted the absurdity of the situation. Everyone knew Juliet 4 was the right aircraft for the job. Everyone except the people making the decisions. 37 minutes after the initial alert, a helicopter finally launched from a base 60 miles away. It would take them nearly an hour to reach FOB Delta, time that critically wounded soldiers might not have. Nico sat in Juliet 4's cockpit, hands gripping the controls of an aircraft that could have completed the mission in half the time. Her crew sat silent around her, professional discipline warring with human frustration. "Skip," Drew said quietly. "This is wrong." She nodded slowly. It was wrong. Completely. Inexcusably wrong. 2 soldiers were bleeding out on a mountain because politics had overruled common sense, because image mattered more than mission, because someone had decided that her crew wasn't worthy of doing the job they'd trained their entire careers to do. But the real breaking point came 3 hours later, when the helicopter finally returned with the wounded soldiers. One made it, the other died during the extended flight, his injuries too severe to survive the delayed evacuation. The after-action briefing was held in the main conference room with full media presence. Major Knox stood at the front, presenting a polished summary of the operation that focused on the heroic efforts of our combat air crews and the successful coordination between air and ground assets. She made no mention of the delayed response, no mention of the soldier who died waiting, no acknowledgement that a faster, more capable aircraft had sat on the tarmac, ready and able to save a life. When questions were opened to the floor, Nico stood up. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "I'd like to clarify the timeline for the medical evacuation." Knox's smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. "Captain Reynolds, I think we've covered the operational details sufficiently, have we?" Nico asked. "Because according to my records, Juliet 4 could have reached FOB Delta in 18 minutes from initial alert. Instead, the evacuation took 97 minutes from start to finish." The room went dead quiet. Camera operators looked uncertain whether they should keep filming. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Captain," Knox said, her voice taking on a warning tone, "operational critiques should be conducted through proper channels, not in public forums." "Ma'am," Nico replied, "when proper channels result in preventable casualties, perhaps public forums are exactly where these discussions belong." The silence that followed was deafening. Knox's polished composure cracked slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Captain Reynolds," she said slowly, "you're out of line." "No, ma'am," Nico said, standing straighter. "I'm exactly where I need to be." That night, alone in Juliet 4's cargo bay, Nico made a decision. She pulled out her mother's hand-drawn chart and studied it by the light of her phone. Her mother had faced her own battles against a system that didn't value what she brought to the fight, but she'd found a way to prove her worth when it mattered most. Now it was Nico's turn. She couldn't change what had happened today, but she could make sure it never happened again. She could be ready for the moment when politics failed and only competence mattered. She could prepare for the night when the lights went out and everyone would need her to light the way home. The investigation began quietly, like all the best intelligence operations. Nico didn't storm into offices demanding answers or file official complaints that would disappear into bureaucratic black holes. Instead, she did what she did best. She prepared methodically, gathering information with the same precision she used for pre-flight checklists. Her first ally was an unexpected one. Master Sergeant Janet Torres, the base's senior administrative specialist, had been watching the political maneuvering with growing disgust. A 22-year veteran who'd seen enough power games to fill a manual, Torres had access to files, regulations, and, most importantly, the kind of institutional memory that couldn't be found in official records. "You want to know something?" "Interesting," Torres said, sliding a folder across her desk during what appeared to be a routine administrative visit. I pulled the mission readiness reports for the past 2 years. Guess which aircraft has the highest completion rate for critical missions? Nico opened the folder and felt her breath catch. The numbers were stark. Juliet 4 had a 97.3% mission completion rate, compared to the squadron average of 89.1%. More telling, when missions were categorized by difficulty, adverse weather, hostile territory, emergency response, her numbers went even higher. There's more, Torres continued, glancing toward the door to ensure they weren't overheard. I cross-referenced these stats with media coverage reports. Interesting pattern emerges. The second sheet showed media mentions by aircraft type. Fighter operations were featured in 847 stories, interviews, and photo spreads over the past 18 months. Cargo operations, despite flying more missions in more dangerous conditions, appeared in exactly 12 mentions, all as background references. Someone's been very careful about controlling the narrative, Torres said quietly. That evening, Nico met with Blake Morrison at a coffee shop off base. Blake had been struggling with his own conscience since the Fob Delta incident, and when Nico reached out, he agreed to talk. I've been flying for 8 years, Blake said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. I've seen good pilots get buried by politics, and I've seen mediocre ones get promoted because they looked good on camera. But what happened yesterday? He shook his head. That crossed a line. I need to know something, Nico said. Is this just about me, or is it bigger? Blake was quiet for a long moment. Derek's got ambitions, he finally said. Squadron commander, then wing commander, maybe stars someday. But his combat record is thin. Most of his missions have been high-visibility, low-risk operations, perfect for media coverage, not so perfect for actual combat experience. So he needs to control the narrative. Exactly. Can't have cargo. Pilots showing up his tactical expertise, can't have support crews getting credit for the dangerous missions. Blake met her eyes. Problem is, you're too good at your job to ignore completely. So instead of competing with you professionally, he's trying to eliminate me politically, Nico finished. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Drew had been quietly networking with other junior officers, and he'd discovered something significant. The new restrictions on cargo operations weren't just affecting Juliet 4. 3. Other cargo crews had been similarly marginalized, their expertise dismissed in favor of primary assets that often couldn't actually complete the required missions. It's systematic, Drew reported during a crew meeting in Juliet 4's cargo bay. They're restructuring the entire support command to minimize cargo operations visibility, making us invisible. Wells, who'd been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. There's something else, he said. I've been talking to some of the older crew chiefs. They remember when your mother flew. Specifically, they remember why she left active duty. Nico looked up sharply. Her mother rarely talked about her military service, especially the end of it. Same playbook, Wells continued. Different decade, same politics. They couldn't question her competence, so they questioned her judgment, made her prove herself over and over until she got tired of fighting and took early retirement. The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. Her mother, the woman who'd taught her that flying was about service, not glory, had been pushed out by the same kind of political maneuvering Nico was facing now. But Wells wasn't finished. Thing is, your mother kept records, detailed records, and according to Torres, those records are still in the base archives. That weekend, Nico found herself in the basement of the base library, surrounded by filing cabinets that hadn't been digitized yet. The records were there, exactly as Wells had indicated, her mother's personnel files, mission reports, and, most importantly, the documentation of her battles against a system determined to diminish her contributions. The parallels were eerie, the same language, the same tactics, even some of the same people now in higher positions. But her mother had made one crucial mistake. She'd fought the system from within, using proper channels and official procedures that could be controlled, delayed, or buried. Nico wasn't going to make that mistake. She pulled out her phone and began photographing the most relevant documents. Then she cross-referenced them with the current situation, building a timeline that showed not just bias, but a pattern of systematic discrimination spanning decades. By Sunday evening, she had what she needed: evidence, allies, and most importantly, a plan that would force the issue into the open, where political maneuvering couldn't control the outcome. The key was timing. She needed a moment when competence would matter more than politics, when actual results would outweigh public relations, when the system's own failures would create the opportunity she needed to prove her worth. She didn't have to wait long. Weather reports were tracking a major storm system moving in from the west, the kind of weather that grounded fair-weather pilots and separated the professionals from the pretenders. Nico smiled as she studied the meteorological data. Her mother's chart was still tucked behind the instrument panel, a reminder that the best pilots weren't the ones who looked good in perfect conditions. They were the ones who could fly when everyone else was grounded. The storm was coming, and when it hit, all the media coverage and political maneuvering in the world wouldn't change one simple fact. Some missions required more than a pretty smile and a photogenic aircraft. They required someone who knew how to fly in the dark. The storm arrived ahead of schedule, rolling in from the western mountains like a wall of angry gray cloud that swallowed the horizon whole. By 1400 hours, visibility had dropped to less than half a mile, and crosswinds were gusting to 30 knots, well beyond the operating limits for most aircraft operations. Nico watched the weather develop from Juliet 4's cockpit, monitoring multiple radio frequencies as base operations struggled to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The afternoon's planned media flights were canceled one by one, and the fighter demonstrations that had been scheduled for visiting journalists were indefinitely postponed. What wasn't canceled, however, was the emergency medical evacuation request that came in at 16:47 hours. "All available aircraft," came the desperate voice of the base emergency coordinator. "We have a critical medical situation at Observatory Ridge. Civilian contractor suffered massive cardiac event. Requires immediate evacuation to trauma center." Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Observatory Ridge was a communications facility perched on a mountain peak 30 miles northeast of base, accessible only by a narrow gravel airstrip that challenged even experienced pilots in good weather. In conditions like these, it might as well have been on the moon. Nico monitored the radio traffic as various aircraft reported their status. Derek's F-16 squadron was grounded due to weather minimums. The base's helicopter units were unable to operate in the high winds and reduced visibility. One by one, every primary asset reported unable to complete the mission. She waited. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, but she needed it to develop naturally. She needed them to ask. 23 minutes passed. The medical coordinator's voice grew increasingly urgent. "Any aircraft capable of mountain operations in reduced visibility, please respond. Patient is in critical condition. Time is running out." Finally, Lieutenant Colonel Harrow's voice cut through the radio chatter. "All available evacuation assets, report capability for Observatory Ridge approach." Nico keyed her radio calmly. "Tower, Juliet 4 is capable and ready for immediate medical. Evacuation to Observatory Ridge." The pause that followed was telling. She could almost hear the internal debate happening in the operations center. The same people who'd been marginalizing her for weeks were now faced with the reality that she might be their only option. Major Knox's voice came through, tight, with barely controlled frustration. "Juliet 4, what's your assessment of current weather conditions for mountain approach?" "Ma'am, conditions are challenging but within acceptable parameters for terrain-following approach. I've flown this route in similar weather conditions." Another pause. Then Harrow. "Juliet 4, you're cleared for immediate launch. Medical team is standing by." As Nico fired up Juliet 4's engines, she noticed something interesting happening across the tarmac. A small crowd had gathered near the operations building. Ground crews, administrative personnel, even some of the grounded fighter pilots. Word was spreading that the cargo hauler was launching into weather that had grounded everything else on base. Drew completed his pre-flight checks with unusual intensity. "Skip," he said quietly. "A lot of people are watching this one." "I know," Nico replied, her hands moving across the controls with practiced ease. "That's the point." The takeoff was smooth despite the crosswinds, but the real test came as they climbed into the teeth of the storm. Visibility dropped to near zero, forcing Nico to rely entirely on instruments and terrain awareness. She flew the route from memory, using valleys and ridgelines she'd memorized over dozens of previous flights. "Jesus," Drew muttered as they threaded between mountain peaks invisible in the gray soup around them. "I can't see anything." "You don't need to see," Nico said calmly. "You need to know where you are." The approach to Observatory Ridge was a masterclass in precision flying. The narrow airstrip was carved into the mountainside with barely enough room for error, surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would destroy any aircraft that strayed off course. In perfect weather, it was challenging. In these conditions, it was nearly impossible. Nearly. Nico brought Juliet 4 down through the clouds like she was threading a needle, using terrain features and wind patterns to guide her approach. When the airstrip finally appeared through the murk, just 50 feet below and perfectly aligned, Drew actually gasped. "How did you—" "Experience," Nico said simply, setting the aircraft down with barely a bump. The evacuation took 12 minutes. The medical team loaded the cardiac patient with practiced efficiency, while Nico kept the engines running, monitoring weather conditions for the return flight. The patient was unconscious but stable, his life depending on reaching the trauma center within the hour. The return flight was even more challenging, as the storm had intensified during their brief time on the mountain. But Nico navigated through the weather with the same calm precision she'd shown on approach, bringing them home through conditions that would have challenged pilots with twice her experience. As Juliet 4 touched down at base, Nico could see the crowd had grown. Ground crews lined the taxiway, watching as she rolled toward the medical facility where an ambulance waited. The patient was transferred smoothly and rushed to the trauma center, where doctors later confirmed that the rapid evacuation had saved his life, but the real impact became clear in the hours that followed. Video footage of the takeoff and landing, shot by various personnel on their phones, began circulating on social media. Unlike the polished official media coverage that had dominated the base's narrative, these videos showed something raw and authentic, a pilot doing an impossible job under impossible conditions, not for cameras or glory, but because someone's life depended on it. Master Sergeant Torres appeared in the operations tent during the post-mission briefing, carrying a thick folder. "Colonel," she said to Harrow, "I thought you might want to review these performance statistics before finalizing the mission report." The folder contained everything Nico had compiled: mission completion rates, weather minimums, evacuation response times, and, most damaging to the current narrative, a detailed comparison showing that cargo operations had consistently outperformed fighter units in actual emergency response scenarios. Major Knox tried to control the damage. "These statistics don't account for the different mission parameters." "Ma'am," Torres interrupted politely, "I've also included mission parameter data. Cargo operations have successfully completed 127 of 131 emergency missions over the past 2 years, including 23 in weather conditions that grounded other assets." The numbers hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone in the room knew what they meant. While fighter operations had been optimized for media coverage, cargo operations had been doing the real work. Derek, who'd been silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. "Those are support missions," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Different skill set entirely." Blake Morrison, who'd been listening from the back of the room, stepped forward. "Actually," he said quietly, "I'd like to see any fighter pilot thread an approach to Observatory Ridge in zero visibility. What Captain Reynolds did today was extraordinary by any measure." The room went quiet. Coming from another fighter pilot, the endorsement carried weight that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Lieutenant Colonel Harrow closed the folder slowly. "Captain Reynolds," he said, "excellent work today. Lives were saved because of your crew's professionalism." It was a simple acknowledgement, but in that moment, everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had shifted. The narrative that had been carefully constructed over months was crumbling, replaced by something more powerful, undeniable proof of competence. As the briefing ended, Nico walked out of the operations tent to find her crew waiting by Juliet 4. But they weren't alone. A dozen other personnel had gathered around the aircraft: mechanics, ground crews, administrative staff, even some pilots from other squadrons. "Hell of a flight, Captain," said one of the crew chiefs. Reminded me why I got into this business in the first place. Similar comments followed from others in the group. These weren't the carefully scripted endorsements that appeared in official media coverage. These were authentic expressions of professional respect from people who understood what they'd witnessed. Wells looked at the gathering crowd and smiled. "Word's getting around," he said quietly. Nico nodded, but she knew this was just the beginning. She'd proven her point under extreme conditions, but institutional change required more than one spectacular flight. The system that had tried to marginalize her was still in place, still controlled by people who valued image over substance. But now she had something she hadn't had before, undeniable evidence of her worth, captured on video and witnessed by dozens of people who couldn't be silenced or dismissed. The storm was passing, but the real weather was just beginning. The confrontation came exactly 1 week later, in the form of an all-hands meeting that Major Knox called under the pretext of clarifying operational protocols and media procedures. Every pilot, crew chief, and senior enlisted personnel on base was required to attend, along with the embedded journalists who'd been covering the squadron's activities. Nico knew what was coming. The Observatory Ridge mission had generated too much positive attention for cargo operations, threatening the carefully constructed narrative that positioned fighter operations as the base's primary capability. Knox needed to regain control of the story, and that meant dealing with the problem of Juliet 4's growing reputation. The base theater was packed, with personnel filling every seat and lining the walls. At the front, a large screen displayed the official agenda: operational excellence and media relations in joint operations. But Nico could feel the underlying tension in the room. Everyone knew this wasn't really about protocols. Major Knox took the podium with her usual polished confidence, but Nico noticed something different in her demeanor. The easy authority was still there, but underneath it was something harder, more desperate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Knox began, "recent events have highlighted the need for clarity regarding our operational priorities and public representation. While we appreciate the dedication shown by all personnel, it's important that we maintain appropriate focus on our primary mission capabilities." She clicked through several slides showing fighter aircraft in action, their sleek profiles gleaming under professional lighting. "Our combat assets represent the pinnacle of American air power, and it's crucial that media coverage reflects this reality." Then came the slide Nico had been expecting, a graph showing mission types by operational priority, with cargo operations relegated to a small slice labeled logistics support. "Support operations," Knox continued, "while valuable, must be understood in their proper context. Emergency responses and ad hoc missions, while dramatic, don't represent our core strategic capabilities." It was a masterful piece of political maneuvering designed to minimize the Observatory Ridge mission by repositioning it as an outlier rather than an example of operational excellence. But Knox made one critical mistake. She underestimated her audience. From the middle of the theater, Master Sergeant Torres stood up. "Ma'am," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the room, "I have a question about those operational priorities." Knox's smile tightened slightly. "Sergeant Torres, questions should be submitted through proper channels." "Ma'am, this seems like the proper channel," Torres interrupted politely. "You're presenting statistics about mission types, but I'm curious about mission success rates. Would you like me to share those numbers with the group?" The room went dead quiet. Knox's composure cracked visibly. "Sergeant, that level of detail isn't appropriate for this forum." "Actually," Lieutenant Colonel Harrow said from the front row, "I think the group would benefit from hearing those statistics. Please proceed, Sergeant Torres." Torres smiled and pulled out a folder. "Over the past 24 months, cargo operations have maintained a 97.3% mission success rate, compared to 89.1% for fighter operations. More significantly, cargo operations have completed 100% of emergency medical evacuations, compared to 23% for other aircraft types." Murmurs rippled through the theater. Knox tried to regain control. "Those statistics don't account for mission complexity." "Actually, ma'am, they do," Torres continued. "Cargo operations have consistently succeeded in adverse weather conditions that grounded other assets. They've completed missions in hostile territory, under equipment failures, and in emergency situations where other aircraft types were unable. To respond, Blake Morrison stood up from his seat near the back. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd like to add something to Sergeant Torres's comments." Knox looked like she wanted to refuse, but with Harrow watching and journalists present, she had little choice. "Go ahead, Captain Morrison." "I've been flying for 8 years, Blake said, his voice carrying across the silent theater. "I've flown with some excellent pilots, and I've seen some outstanding operations. But what Captain Reynolds and her crew did at Observatory Ridge was the finest piece of flying I've ever witnessed." He paused, letting his words sink in. "That wasn't luck or a simple cargo run. That was precision flying under conditions that would challenge any pilot in any aircraft, and it saved a man's life." More murmurs, louder now. Knox's carefully planned presentation was slipping away from her, but she made one final attempt to regain control. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice taking on an edge, "while we appreciate Captain Reynolds's enthusiasm, we need to maintain perspective about operational capabilities. Emergency responses are not the same as combat. Operations, that's when Derek Rawlings made his fatal mistake." He stood up from the front row, his expression showing the frustration that had been building since Observatory Ridge. "Exactly," he said, his voice carrying the arrogance that had defined his attitude for months. "Flying cargo in bad weather is impressive, but let's not pretend it's the same as real combat flying. Anyone can follow a GPS through clouds." The words hung in the air like a slap. Derek had just dismissed not only Nico's capabilities, but the expertise of every cargo pilot in the room. Worse, he'd done it in front of an audience that included veterans who'd flown combat missions in aircraft just like Juliet 4. Wells stood up slowly from his seat near the wall. "Son," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the theater, "I jumped out of aircraft like Juliet 4 for 20 years, including 12 combat deployments. I've seen plenty of pilots who could make their aircraft dance in perfect weather. But I've only known a few who could navigate mountains in zero visibility using nothing but terrain features and wind patterns." He paused, looking directly at Derek. "Captain Reynolds doesn't follow GPS through clouds. Last week, when GPS was down and visibility was zero, she flew that aircraft to Observatory Ridge using dead reckoning and terrain masking techniques that most pilots couldn't manage in perfect conditions." The theater was completely silent now. Even the journalists had stopped taking notes, sensing they were witnessing something more significant than a routine briefing. Drew Martinez stood up next. "Sir," he said to Derek, "with respect, you've never flown with Captain Reynolds in actual adverse conditions." "I have. For 2 years I've watched her complete missions that other pilots wouldn't even attempt. She doesn't fly cargo. She flies whatever the mission requires, whenever it's required, under any conditions." Then Ezra stood, followed by 3 other crew members from different aircraft. One by one, they offered quiet testimonials about flying. With cargo crews, about missions completed when other assets were grounded, about professionalism that prioritized mission success over personal recognition. Major Knox watched her carefully planned presentation collapse in real time. The narrative she'd tried to construct was being dismantled by the very people she'd tried to marginalize. Finally, Nico herself stood up. "Ma'am," she said, her voice calm and professional, "I'd like to address Captain Rawlings's comment about following GPS through clouds." Knox looked like she wanted to refuse, but the momentum in the room had shifted completely. "Go ahead, Captain." Nico reached into her flight bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a hand-drawn approach chart," she said, holding it up so the room could see. "It was drawn by my mother during a Pacific storm in 1994, when she brought home a crew flying on instruments alone, with no radar, no GPS, just skill and determination." She paused, looking around the room. "Last week at Observatory Ridge, I used the same techniques my mother used 30 years ago. Not because the technology failed, but because sometimes technology isn't enough. Sometimes you need a pilot who understands that flying isn't about looking good in perfect conditions, it's about getting the job done when everything else fails." She folded the chart carefully and put it away. "Captain Rawlings, you're right about one thing. What I do isn't the same as what you do. What I do is harder." The silence that followed was absolute. Knox stood at the podium, her presentation in ruins, her narrative completely destroyed. Derek sat frozen, his arrogance finally revealed as the hollow posturing it had always been. Lieutenant Colonel Harrow stood up slowly. "Thank you, Captain Reynolds," he said. "I think you've clarified things considerably." He turned to address the room. "This briefing is concluded. Captain Reynolds, please see me in my office at your earliest convenience." As personnel began filing out of the theater, Nico felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Blake Morrison smiling at her. "That," he said quietly, "was exactly what needed to be said." Around them, dozens of other personnel were approaching, offering congratulations and expressions of support. For the first time in months, Nico felt like she belonged exactly where she was. The fight wasn't over. Institutional change would take time, and there would be other battles to come. But in that moment, in front of everyone who mattered, she had proven something that couldn't be argued or dismissed. Competence speaks louder than politics, and real professionals recognize each other, regardless of what aircraft they fly. 6 months later, Nico stood in the same desert heat that had started it all, but everything around her had changed. The tarmac still shimmered with waves of heat, but Juliet 4 was no longer parked at the forgotten edge of the airfield. She sat prominently near the main operations building, her crew preparing for their third high-priority mission of the week. The changes had come gradually at first, then with gathering momentum. Within 2 weeks of the all-hands meeting, Lieutenant Colonel Harrow had quietly reassigned Major Knox to a desk job at headquarters, citing the need for fresh perspectives in public affairs. Derek Rawlings found himself transferred to a training squadron where his media-friendly appearance could be put to use teaching new pilots rather than undermining experienced ones. More importantly, the base's operational priorities had been restructured to reflect actual capabilities rather than public relations considerations. Cargo operations were no longer classified as support pending. They were recognized as specialized assets with unique capabilities that complemented rather than competed with fighter operations. The transformation had been noticed far beyond their base. Military aviation magazines ran feature articles about the cargo pilot who saved a life in impossible conditions. Professional journals published analyses of Nico's observatory ridge approach, using it as a case study in precision. Flying under adverse conditions. The video footage shot by ground personnel had gone viral, garnering millions of views and thousands of comments from pilots around the world who recognized true skill when they saw it. But the recognition that mattered most to Nico came from her peers. Blake Morrison had put in for a transfer to cargo operations, saying he wanted to learn from the real professionals. 3 other fighter pilots had quietly approached her for advice on weather flying and terrain navigation. Even some of Derek's former squadron mates had begun treating her with the respect her capabilities had always deserved. The most satisfying change, however, was operational. When emergencies arose, and they still did regularly, the first question from base operations was no longer which primary assets are available, but rather which aircraft is best suited for this mission. More often than not, that aircraft was Juliet 4. Drew had been promoted to aircraft commander, with Nico's enthusiastic recommendation, and was preparing to take command of his own crew. Wells had decided to stay active duty for an additional 3 years, saying he wasn't ready to leave the best flying outfit in the Air Force. Ezra had been selected for advanced avionics training, a career milestone he'd been pursuing for years. Master Sergeant Torres had been recognized with a commendation for her role in improving operational transparency and mission effectiveness. Military language for calling out injustice and fighting for what was right. She'd been promoted to Senior Master Sergeant and assigned as the base's new operations senior enlisted leader. On this particular morning, as Nico completed her pre-flight inspection, she noticed a young lieutenant approaching hesitantly. The woman wore new flight wings and carried herself with the mixture of confidence and uncertainty that marked all new pilots. "Captain Reynolds," the lieutenant said, "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I'm being assigned to cargo operations, and I was wondering, could I watch your pre-flight routine? I've heard you're someone worth learning from." Nico smiled, remembering her own early days when she'd watched experienced pilots with the same hungry attention to detail. "Of course," she said. "But first, let me show you something." She led Sarah to Juliet 4's cockpit and opened the panel behind the instrument cluster. The hand-drawn chart was still there, her mother's careful pencil lines as clear as the day they were drawn. "This was my mother's," Nico explained. "She drew it during a storm 30 years ago when she had to bring home a crew flying on instruments, alone. She taught me that flying isn't about the aircraft you're in. It's about knowing your capabilities and never accepting limitations other people try to place on you." Sarah studied the chart carefully. "What happened to her?" she asked, quietly. "She got tired of fighting a system that didn't value what she brought to the mission," Nico said. "But she never stopped being an exceptional pilot, and she never stopped believing that competence matters more than politics." She carefully folded the chart and put it back in its place. "The difference is, I had better allies when my fight came. And now you do too." As they walked through the pre-flight inspection together, Nico felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or revenge. She had fought for something bigger than personal vindication. She had fought for the principle that merit should matter more than image, that real professionals should be valued regardless of which aircraft they flew or how they looked on camera. The system hadn't changed completely. There were still politics, still people who valued appearance over substance, but now there was also precedent, proof that competence could overcome prejudice when the right people were willing to stand up and be counted. That afternoon, as Juliet 4 lifted off for another mission, this one a medical evacuation to a remote site where only her unique capabilities could reach, Nico reflected on the words her mother had written at the bottom of that hand-drawn chart. "When they can't see you coming, that's when you matter most." She had been invisible for a long time, overlooked and undervalued by people who mistook quiet competence for lack of ambition. But when the moment came, when lives hung in the balance and no one else could do the job, she had been ready. And now, as she guided Juliet 4 through clear skies toward another mission that would save lives and serve her country, she realized that being ready was enough. More than enough, the young lieutenant in the right seat was taking careful notes, learning from someone who had proven that the best pilots aren't the ones who look good in perfect conditions. They're the ones who can fly straight through the storm and light the way for everyone else to follow. Some people spend their careers waiting to be chosen, others prepare quietly, without fanfare, until the moment when they're the only ones who can rise to meet the challenge. Nico had always known which kind of pilot she wanted to be, and now finally, everyone else knew it too. In the end, this was never really a story about revenge. It was about knowing your worth when no one else does, about leading without recognition, and about flying straight through doubt to light the way for others. Sometimes the most important battles aren't won with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. They're won by simply being excellent at what you do, consistently and without compromise, until excellence can no longer be ignored. If this story moved you, take a moment to think about the quiet professionals in your own life, the people who do essential work without seeking spotlight, who prepare for the moments when their skills will matter most. They're the ones who keep the world running when the cameras aren't rolling and the politicians aren't watching. Recognition matters, but competence matters more, and sometimes the best revenge is simply being undeniably good at what you do. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.